Hello. The close study of singular aspects of building culture remains the mainstay of good architectural scholarship. Through detail, universals can be revealed. This is the case with architect and senior scientist at the University of Innsbruck, Tim Altenhof's Breathing Space, the Architecture of Pneumatic Beings, published by Zone Books in March this year and distributed by Princeton University Press, and which is the subject of the latest Airs for Architecture podcast episode. Breathing Space is a rather timely exploration of the role of breath, breathing, in the development of buildings, and the way consciousness of the human lung, our mnemonic nature, as science, imaginary and analogy, has shaped architectural design, not least in the way buildings and bodies inhale and exhale, draw in the outside, and emit what is hidden or unwanted within. Our discussion of a little of Tim's book focuses on the concept of respiratory modernism, which we unpack, before going on to talk about ways architecture has historically engaged with the body, air, and atmosphere in response to wider scientific and political concerns around health and the modern city. And how does this thinking around breathing, bodies, environment and habitation come to us now, in this age of socially distanced ultramodernity?
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Airs for Architecture podcast. I'm talking today to Dr. Tim Altenhof. Dr. Tim, thank you so much for joining me. I'm delighted to be recording this podcast with you, and we're going to be talking about your very recent book, Breathing Space, The Architecture of Pneumatic Beings, which came out with Zone Books earlier this month. Before we get to that, and its complex, technical, scientific and historiographical research, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely, Ambrose. Thanks so much for having me. To begin with, I'm Tim. I'm a trained architect, an educator. I teach architecture. I'm an author. I do research. I teach at the University of Innsbruck with the position of a senior scientist. I've been doing design work also, but this has been pushed to the back burner. So fully academic by now, something I had not possibly envisioned. That at one point I felt like I could balance these two realms, but I think academic work has been so consuming that I lost track of design work. So I'm not exactly sure whether I would still be considered a professional architect, but I think I am in spirit and full-heartedly. I'm currently in Brooklyn. I teach in Innsbruck, as I said. I grew up at Lake Constance, southern part of Germany. I studied architecture for many years. In Vienna, at the Bauhaus University to begin with for 2 years. Then I moved to Vienna, studied at the Art Academy of Fine Arts there in the University of Applied Arts. Worked as an architect for 3 years, most recently in Zaha Hadid's office in Hamburg. And then at one point decided to enroll in a PhD program and commenced my studies at Yale University then in 2012 and graduated there in 2018. And then began my position in Innsbruck later on.
Fantastic. So why are you in Brooklyn? I mean, other than the fact that it's incredibly cool.
That's family related because my wife teaches here. She's a professor now, so we have to juggle with family life across the Atlantic.
It's a as I said, very interesting book. And as I read it, and I want to understand why you wrote this book, where it comes from, and I suppose the relationship between what you were thinking when you were in practice, how you came to your doctoral studies, and now this book. It seems to me to be quite a story of Central European invention and discovery. So it seems opposite to me that you're from that part of the world. Is that fair?
I mean, it is. I think it's fair. I think it's fair to say it's absolutely continental European. I mean, there are a few American sources, but it's predominantly there is an underlying Swiss theme, as has been observed by others as well. There is UK material, but I think it's more first and foremost it's really continental European, and that might have to do with my own biography. I wouldn't say it's autobiographical; it certainly is not. But I think it helped me to connect with some of these materials probably better than with others.
I'm always interested in the timeliness of books, is why you decided to make this study. And the last prompt that I sent you perhaps feels to me like a closing of the circle that you open up in the book, which is the emergence, the re-emergence, perhaps in architectural production and the architectural imagination of the biomimetic in architecture. And it seems to me that the story that you tell about pneumatic architecture, the architecture of the breathing body, is quite closely aligned to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think in many ways, it is. I think part and parcel of that story of why I mean, maybe first to begin with, why it's called pneumatic beings. I always had in mind in German something like Atemmensch, with that doesn't really translate so easily into English. But I think pneumatic beings also opens it up because it's not entirely confined to human beings, even though, you know, in passing I mentioned animals, but I think there is plants, of course, operating in the cycle as well. And I think just calling it in English pneumatic beings opens it up to the full panoply of beings that facilitate or participate in this process. But I think really the idea of this book is that beginning, say, from the mid-19th century onward, there was an increased awareness for all things respiratory, and something that usually takes place in the background. So it's part of the autonomic nervous system because it's a vital activity. So we don't really think about it. It just happens. We can somewhat not really control it. We can potentially inflect with apnoe, diving, deep diving, with yoga practice. Meditation, of course, but you can't really suspend breathing. You can't really stop it at any given point. It's a vital activity. And I think that is something that usually operates in the background, and in certain moments in history, it just comes to the fore. And it did so recently also during the COVID pandemic, when all of a sudden, all things respiratory were all the rage, and they covered the media across the world, and potentially all relatives with whom you spoke on the phone were concerned with issues of lungs and breathing and whatnot. And I think it just flared up, and then it disappears again, and it fades out. But really the idea is that architecture, certain architectures in that period, based on that paradigm or that mindset, they were designed, at least that's what I'm trying to argue for, they were designed based on the consciously breathing being, if that makes sense. And I think there is a certain, not exactly a conflation between the building or say the house, the breathing being, and the atmosphere, but I think they correlate much more fluently than they possibly do nowadays, if that makes sense.
It does make sense, and I think we'll come on to that. The phrase you use, and I'm not sure if it is your phrase, is this idea of respiratory modernism, which, as I said in my notes to you, which I sent a mere 3 hours ago, for which I apologize. It's very seductive. It sounds really good. Something hemostatic about it. Can you talk a little bit about where this thing comes from? Because as you just described it, it seemed like a very conscious and strategic thing in an early modern period, as if there was an underlying understanding of the necessity of this approach to things, that the modern paradigm and the technologies that form it had enabled architects to think about the respiratory system in new ways, or at all, for the first time. So I'd love to understand a little bit more about, I guess, the social or political grain that was there at the time off which this thing emerged.
No, that's a great question. So I think it's important. I write that somewhere in the introduction. I mean, the book doesn't really have an introduction, so I was trying to dispense with.
It really doesn't, by the way. It's just like straight into the story.
Yeah, so no introduction. I dispensed with the introduction and the conclusion, which always feels very static in a great many academic books, and oftentimes, especially at grad school, when you're bombarded with so many readings per week, usually skim through these books, and what I think many readers usually do, they read the introduction and then they're fully accomplished or arrived at a certain understanding of the book, which is so reductionist, of course, and at the same time it feels like so much more is ingrained in many of these chapters. So I was always trying to circumvent that idea. So in the first chapter, which facilitates something like an introductory part also, I think I somewhere referred to the late Detlef Mertens, and he has an incredibly lucid say, definition of these terms, which took me quite some time when I was an architecture student myself to come to terms with: modernity, modernization, modernism. It's really a compound. Then there is a modern architecture, there is modernist architecture, there is architecture in the modern period. It's very discombobulated in many terms, and at the same time, most of these terms, I think, mean something very specific. And Mertens, in that regard, I think he tried to define modernity as something that can be understood as a specific historic period, whereas modernization would be something like the transformation of material culture that happened in reaction to that, and modernism as such would be a cultural reaction to core that somewhat aspires to the status of a new norm. And I think much of what we learned in architecture school in terms of modern architecture is so scholarly, profound, and really, so deeply entrenched in certain notions: industrialization, serial production, material culture, the notions of the avant-garde, heavily codified in many ways. So it felt like the history has been written, and to reopen that, to reassess that, is felt like a challenging endeavor. And I thought, once I began to do some close readings, it's not a direct answer maybe to your question, but I try to get at that. And doing some close readings then in grad school, because the great thing about the PhD program in the US, at least in the ways I've experienced that, is that you have 2 years of mandatory coursework. So especially at an Ivy League, of course, you can go pick seminars across campus if you desire to do so. Before you even begin to work on your prospectus. It's almost like a new preliminary foundational education before you get to the point of coming up with a thesis. And that opens Pandora's box, of course, because you can take seminars in history and in medical schools if you wanted to, in philosophy and art history and so forth. So you can be exposed to a great many methods and approaches and ways of thinking, but also topics and subjects. And I think revisiting some of the more canonical works, so also coming back to your initial question, continental European discourse, or say historiography, I think at one point I began to do close readings of earlier works of Sigurd Gideon, who was a student of Heinrich Wölfflin, and I began to discover many of these, say, allusions or insinuations to all things respiratory. And I thought there was a certain undercurrent, hints. Sometimes it was very obvious, sometimes it was more embedded in a relative clause. And I began to understand that there was a certain awareness. And of course, in other books, as pertains to Le Corbusier, for instance, it's quite blatant because there are quite literally illustrations of lungs in some of these books. And I found sketches in the archives in Paris. So why would architects, but also architectural critics at the time, which was a new type of writing. Gideon was trained in art history, so usually the architectural historians were all trained art historians by the time. So why would they be concerned with issues of breathing? Why would they be even aware of that and try to implement that into discussions of architecture? It was quite baffling to me. And I think, to begin with, there was one of the fundamental tropes of modern architecture in that period is, of course, that the interior and the exterior, they blur together. That's usually one of the ways in which it's been described. Venturi later speaks of flowing space, but there was really this understanding or a claim that inside and outside begin to coalesce, they conflate, they become one, and has lots to do with, I think, the elimination of the say, the load-bearing exterior walls, so the introduction of all glass panels and curtain walls. Transparency is a big topic, but there was this undercurrent where I began to trace certain ideas that had to do with air and air in motion and airflow. So it wasn't just only visual and issues of transparency, but I thought at one point it was too obvious that breathing was also at stake. And if you begin to think about these analogies between the body-building relationship, I think the one seminal thing that tries to overcome our division as human beings with the natural world is really by dint of breathing. And that's the lung to core is exactly what facilitates this very idea of breaking down boundaries between interior and exterior. Because for one, the lung is absolutely, I mean, there is no doubt that it's buried deep inside our thoracic cage. But at the same time, the minute we are born, we plug ourselves into the atmosphere and maintain this connection for as long as we live. So there is a certain ambiguity. It's also a topological problem, if you will, because is the lung an internal organ or is it external? It's both and at the same time. And expanding this discourse then beyond, I think, clearly disciplinary boundaries of architecture just brought to bear entire culture, breathing culture, as I call it. And I think that is really what constitutes respiratory modernism, that you have in many of these disciplines, culture, broadly speaking, an astute awareness of all things respiratory. And the argument is that this culture in particular also infiltrated or reflected architectural discourse. So I think these impacts, they are for one to be found in buildings, but they are also there is also textual evidence. So in writing, in historiography, in archival materials, drawings, illustrations, but also the ways in which buildings operate. And I think all of this together really constitutes respiratory modernism for me. So it's not really about style. It's not really about the avant-garde. It's not really about material culture, but it has more to do with the mentality and with an understanding of what I then coin pneumatic beings and a deeper understanding of physiology and how and the kinds of encasements they want to inhabit. I think that's really what it is.
It's a very thorough description. I did like the way, just as a point, I did like the way you described the PhD program in Ivy League universities as opening up a Pandora's box, which is not normally a good thing. I just put that there. We normally try and avoid that. But I want to come back to this notion that you just talked about, which is that it wasn't specifically avant-garde. And yet, to me, it seems from your description and that first case that you cover in detail, which is Mendelssohn's extraordinary and beautiful dye works at Luckenwalde, a really, really beautiful building, where there's obviously, as a consequence of this new industrial process, there is this pathology, this pathological condition created within dye works facilities in a town known for its hat manufacturing. And to me, that seems a little bit to be the motivating factor here, is that we have an industrial working class. The emergence of an industrial working class is in the century and a half before that. And there's new pathologies that relate to that, which make, in the case of your work, the lungs become very evident. In a way, your description of the interiority or the exteriority of the lungs, they become very exterior because you've got lots and lots of men and women and children dying as a consequence of new types of pathology. So I guess my question would be along the lines of, was there a broader kind of political dimension or a social dimension which was starting to look at the internal bodily well-being of ordinary people, working class people, industrial class people? And does the architecture sort of derive, the architectural motivation derive from that?
Yeah, I suppose it did. I mean, it didn't really go in lockstep, say, these explorations. There is lots to be said about discourse in England in particular, of course, because it was clearly the leading industrialized country and nation in Europe at the time. So if you look at one of the seminal works, Friedrich Engels, for instance, his scathing critique of the working class in England at the time in the 1840s, it came out, and he is a very scathing critique of London as an industrialized metropolis, as it were, and issues of overcrowding and how the working class is all crammed together, and the ways in which the city is laid out. Stifled stamps, so not only are they being stifled inside because it's overcrowded houses in which they are to be accommodated, but also then the wind is unable to disperse the vitiated air that lingers in the streets, and then everything is polluted because of the industrialized processes. So all of that is, of course, to be directed at say improvements of the working class, because it's the poor that suffer the most. And what is quite interesting Then later, if you look at any of the standard works today in the architecture profession, so Neufert, for instance, would be one of the reference works. Of course, if in any competition, you would probably begin with looking into Neufert if you want to know anything about the size of a lobby of a museum. If you were to plan one, because there are certain stipulations or requirements for X number of people, you need X number of bathrooms, you need X number of entries, you need X number of square foot or say surface area, but also volume. And I think that is quite interesting that based on many of these discussions that stem from, say, hygiene, but also experimental hygiene, people like Pettenkofer, and then I think the discourse in England was really leading because it already began in the 1840s and 50s, was that at one point, and I found one trace in particular with regard to Germany in the 1880s, then there was a new requirement that, the government mandated a particular amount of air volume per person in order to countervail overcrowding. And that's quite interesting because I would argue that usually architects tend to think in terms of square meters, although we are trained as spatial professionals. And even if you ask the general population about the size of their apartments, they would usually say it's 100 square meters, 120 square meters. I mean, who's of our architect friends, even the trained ones, would tell you that they occupy 550 cubic meters. I mean, I have no idea about the air volume of my apartment. I'm absolute clueless. I mean, I can tell you something about the square meters possibly, but so this disconnect between surface area as something that is flat and that is metric and that can be traced with regard to the actual space that we inhabit, but as a metrics also. That was something that came out of this concern that at one point people in say governments in Europe, they mandated that X number of cubic meters of air volume per person is required. So this very idea that space is actually filled with air and that we inhabit this air somewhat lingers behind these discussions. And that's really where it comes from. So I think it's a twofold development that I'm trying to trace also there. For one, I think it has to do with hygiene and health. So issues of the industrialization that are very palpable and direct because they affect the human body, broadly speaking. And at the same time, there is also an idea that then develops side by side alongside this, say, preoccupation with hygiene and health that has more to do with, let's say, a spiritual exploration of the modern conditions. So that comes up in discussions I have later in the book also with regard to, say, Émile Jacques Dalcroze, one of the forefathers of modern dance, Johannes Itten, and some of these other sectarian crackpots, I shall say, like Harnisch, who was a big influence for Itten. But you have some of these avant-garde pedagogical practices, also in Hellerau in Germany at the Bauhaus in the preliminary course, where there is a certain understanding of the modern subject whose connection between body and mind has been severed as a result of the modern condition. And there were certain reactions to that don't directly pertain to health per se, but they are more trying to get back and sync body and mind. And one of the understandings in these leading figures, like Gross in particular, Itten and so on and so forth, was an understanding that there is an internal meter. I know it's the other way around, actually. There is an external meter. So the modern condition is somewhat governed by time. There are certain requirements. It's clock-based time, but then there is also rhythm that is more corporeal. And that has to do, of course, with the heart's pulse rate, but also with the respiratory rhythm, with human respiration. And trying to tap into that and trying to realign body and mind was one of their ideas to remedy, say, the negative effects of modernization. So it's health for one, and I think the second really big theme there is more spiritual, maybe moral.
That's really very interesting. My wife is a member of a interesting Wittgenstein discussion group. Wittgenstein as translated through one particular philosopher, and they have this kind of running meme in their WhatsApp group, which is called Cogito in the Wild, where you see examples of Descartes' I think, therefore I am, the mind-body dualism emerging in adverts and things like this. And I'm going to mention the one that you just made just then. This is not quite so wild. This is like Cogito almost in the wild. I'm going to tell her about this because it's a very interesting one, and I've seen this emerging in a number of the recent podcasts that I've done, particularly the ones that are looking around, shall we call it decolonization, or other histories, or other ontologies, which don't derive from this kind of very powerful Enlightenment kind of scientism that do sort of depend upon or descend from the mind-body split. And these new discussions around other histories and other philosophies which have never accepted or now no longer accept that as being good enough or sufficient to the description of the reality as they see it. So I find that very interesting that, as you call it, this spiritual dimension exists even in this early period where you've obviously got some of the trappings of modernity still in, absolutely in full flow, industrialization still going, colonialism's just really getting into its running, and so on and so forth. But I was also wondering about this idea of the scientific body as well. I was kind of interested in the exploration of the human body, this idea of an architecture that is much more about a kind of haptic an embodied engagement with reality. So if modernity is quite often described as a process of alienation or abstraction, of stepping back, in the case of what you're describing, this is about a kind of getting inside. It's a kind of a much closer looking, which I think is kind of intriguing and perhaps counterintuitive for the way that modern architecture of the modern period is often described.
Yeah, I would I would agree. I mean, the great thing that always struck me. I mean, it goes all the way back. I shall say, a historian of medicine, of course. So I have superficial knowledge of its long durée, say, historiography or even the history and its many references and impacts on architectural discourse. But of course, physiology goes all the way back to ancient Greek antiquity. I mean, it's Hippocrates and then later Galen, but also Aristotle at one point. I think he had an understanding of certain, say, relationship between function and processes or inner workings. And I think that's really the striking feature that physiology brings to bear, that it has a desire to understand the inner workings, the processes of the human body, something that happens inside. And I think this, with regard to architecture, has a long standing relationship also that I cannot exactly pinpoint. I mean, there are first allusions clearly in Alberti, where you have bodily metaphors. So I think it's clearly rooted in the Renaissance. But even in modern architecture, I mean, one of the most obvious and striking metaphors, of course, is skin. So the very moment really the load-bearing exterior wall gets liberated from its structural duties and becomes something else, because structure is being implemented elsewhere in the building, we begin to find different terms and just dump them onto this new element, which is not exactly a new element. It just operates in a different way. So here too, it's more the function. So then we come up with ideas of the screen, of the envelope nowadays. But the most obvious one is skin, of course. So the building skin is what envelopes the interior space. So it's no longer the wall. And I think that's something in architecture that clearly emerges in the modern period. And of course, there are many more of these allusions where there are more implicit and sometimes more explicit references to corporeal ideas that inform or inflect our ways of understanding architecture. And I think in German, a very common or popular concept or term is Baukörper, of course, which is not so common in English. It often gets translated in German texts of the time as building body, because that's really the literal translation of it. But just by referring to a structure as a building body brings so much luggage and implicit connotations that we can't really disentangle in each and every case. But the sheer idea, I think Adrian Foti also has a great mini chapter in Words and Buildings, where he traced or tried to trace the emergence of circulation in architectural discourse, which is not so easy. I recall, reading it many years ago, that at one point, I think he first encountered it in a public lecture by Viollet-le-Duc in the 1870s, where circulation was used as a concept in architecture. And this too, of course, has to do with physiology, because it describes the human blood flow, and gets then transcribed in architecture, and informs our understanding of the building in ways that try to come to terms with flows of bodies, flows of goods inside the building. But circulation too is a bodily metaphor, and I think with regards to breathing, this is something in particular there that I tried to discuss at length in the book, that the boundaries we usually set between breathing and ventilation, they begin to blur. It's not exactly one thing, but they resonate so closely with each other in this period that you can't really tear apart or separate the two ideas. For one, assuming that breathing is something that has to do with living beings, and ventilation has to do with buildings, because for one, it's the same. And I think second, usually breathing is more understood in say a secondary degree, that it also has to do with the chemical processes or the biochemical processes that take place in cells. Then once oxygen is actually delivered to the cells, but then it begins to break apart into respiration and breathing. But usually breathing just means the replacement of vitiated or exhausted air with fresh air in the human body, and that's exactly what ventilation does in buildings. And ventilation, in the first place, we wouldn't need it if there were not breathing beings inside a building. I mean, of course, ventilation prevents certain materials, say deteriorate processes of decay or deterioration, the buildup of mold, and so on and so forth. So we all know that uninhabited buildings begin to rot or decay at one point. So you have to maintain them. You have to keep the pipes running. You have to ventilate them, because you don't want to build up humidity inside. But usually the main objective, the main rationale behind ideas of ventilation in architecture is because there are breathing beings inside, and they require certain qualities of air. So at one point, it perhaps no longer makes sense to strictly separate breathing and ventilation, and especially in this understanding of the building-body relationship and the various, say, the traffic between metaphors between the two, I think breathing and ventilation begin to blur also, and that's the interesting aspect or dimension of it for me in this discourse, that there are ways of understanding the building not so much as a technical object, but as something that caters to the human body and to animal bodies, and they are breathing, and that's because buildings have to perform in a certain way.
It's almost like you're describing the architect at this period as a Dr. Frankenstein, that what he has to do, or she has to do, well, it's predominantly he, isn't it, has to do is design a building almost like another creature, to start to consider architecture as having a measure of agency in the production of life, which is a very lovely idea. And I did want to ask, though, if you could, to trace the emergence of this thing, of the pneumatic building, the buildings for pneumatic beings, this respiratory modernism, through a few case studies. If listeners were to want to nail some really good kind of a really good chronology, what would you suggest?
I mean, I have in the book, I think I've attempted to pinpoint. It's somewhat fluid, of course, but I think I've tried to pinpoint. I shall maybe differentiate between actual buildings or built structures and discourse, because I think there are so many textual references and debates. So things that build up discourse, and then there are the actual structures, case studies, if you will, which are then embedded in this broader cultural cloud. And I think part of what I've been trying to pinpoint in the book is something around the mid-19th century, and beginning with what we've discussed earlier, with regards to experimental hygiene, the problem of overcrowding, industrialization, air pollution, and so on and so forth. There was much debate in these years, 1850s, 1860s, also with experimentation, especially one of the seminal figures was Max von Pettenkofer, who also is mentioned in passing in Benham's The Architecture of the Well-Tempered Environment, which is where I encountered his work, I think for the first time, if I remember correctly. And so this is outside of architecture. It's really medical scholars and environmental hygienists that begin to explore the relationship between bodies and buildings, and they come to understand that. And this is one of the prime ideas that struck me. I was baffled for quite some time, because nowadays, if we come to think of air pollution, of course, if it's anthropogenic, which is to say human-made, of course, we usually come to understand that it's the byproduct of all our lives, and we become to harm and damage the atmosphere in the ways in which we live, and through our production modes and processes and industrialization and so on and so forth. So it's clearly anthropogenic because it's human-made. We can call it the Anthropocene. We can find other ways of describing it, but there is a particular understanding in the second half of the 19th century, especially in the circles of experimental hygienists, that air pollution is anthropogenic, but much more literal. So it's really the human breathing subject that is the prime culprit in all of these debates, because you cannot dwell without breathing, and by dwelling, or in so doing, in dwelling, you also breathe, and because of your breathing, you vitiate the air inside, and that is the underlying premise for all of these ideas, that the house should be leaky, that Pettenkofer has these absolute, almost borderline poetic expressions where he claims that the house, or he claims that the house actually communicates freely with the atmosphere, because they come to do all these experiments and claim that walls actually are porous, that there are pores in the walls. They make experiments with brick and come to demonstrate that brick is actually porous, scientific study. So that's quite interesting, because here too, what is being transcribed on an understanding of walls is also an underlying understanding of the human skin, which is porous and pervious, of course. So pores in brick walls are what facilitate air exchange. So it's not necessarily just the windows and doors, or say the prime apertures we all know from architecture school, but the very idea of the wall is something that is more of an interface, something that leaks and that facilitates this approach. So I think, rather than a clear architectural case study, I would say this is a case study in hygienic discourse. And there are popular lectures that he gave in the 1870s, Pettenkofer, that is, and of course there is a predominant understanding in that time that walls, of course, are airtight. They are not meant to be architectural elements that allow for any kind of traffic. They're usually barriers. They shut us off. They provide shelter. And then Pettenkofer, on this micro level of addressing the very foundational element of architecture, we can say, on a scientific physiological level, not as an architect but as a hygienist, comes to understand that in fact there is air traffic going through the walls, and this is quite interesting. And so I think also with regard to one of the questions that you sent earlier, so I think this is precisely not the paradigm of airtight containers and enclosures that sever us from the environment, that somewhat trap us inside for the sake of energy efficiency or potentially even health, because air is then filtered, of course, and not directly admitted. But there is a strong advocacy in the second half of the 19th century in favor of the leaky house. So everything we or say, for the better or worse, we try to avoid nowadays was actually presented as something desirable. The house should be leaky because it has to be embedded in the broader atmosphere and has to communicate freely. There is no division in that regard too between the interior and the exterior, because we are the ones who inhabit the interior space. And by doing that, we cause harm to ourselves. And there are actually strong and very opinionated figures in these circles. Also, Louis Leeds, who was a ventilation expert from the United States, and he once said in one of his books that man really is the greatest enemy because man breathes, and that's the prime problem in dwelling. And then, of course, much of that debate, as I try to explicate more through some of these case studies, and you mentioned Mendelssohn, then at Luckenwalde, of course. So I think there is a certain delay in that discourse until it fully come as it fully fledged found its expression then in architecture. But there is a sanatorium that I discussed from 1909, for instance, in Switzerland. There is Mendelssohn's Head Factory from 1921, the Bauhaus Dessau. So with some of these, I try to address different aspects of the, say, architectural responsiveness to this cultural awareness. And I think windows, for one, are the most obvious. I mean, it's at once very banal and brazen to come to think of windows and just opening windows. Of course, it's the most obvious thing, but I think how many of us do actually work in corporate and commercial office buildings, and even the Yale School of Architecture, which I also write somewhere in the acknowledgements, that I spent several years in an architecture school, which is one of the most famous buildings to be in as an architect student, and you cannot open a single window. So even something so simple and basic and fundamental is not within reach for many of us in everyday life. And Mendelssohn, of course, is a very special case, as you already alluded to, with the dye works, because here there was a particular industrial problem with regards to the production of felt, or the dyeing of felt, that caused or engendered the emergence of all these toxic fumes, and then put at risk a particular kind of worker. So not everyone, of course, was exposed to that, and in a different way. The sanatorium then, from around the turn of the 20th century, I think, was one of the most striking examples for me in terms of understanding architecture no longer as something that shields us off from the atmosphere, which is one of the founding myths, of course, in many architectural theory classes. The ways in which I have been taught as a student, of course, is that the prime idea of architecture as something that provides shelter, that shields us off from the vicissitudes of the climate, of weather, of course, of inclement weather. So we seek shelter. But here suddenly you have a building whose prime objective is exposure to the atmosphere. It's precisely the opposite. It really understands the atmosphere itself as the prime human habitat, and not so much an enclosed interior space. So I think many of these case studies begin to emerge after the turn of the 20th century, but there is textual references and much debate and discourses that begin to emerge from the mid-19th century onwards.
How is this communicated to the public? Because obviously an architect's principal role, well, that's probably quite controversial, but it's a very significant role, is selling drawings for money to the public and persuading people to a certain degree of the logic that they have adopted. How was this notion, this relationship, and this essential critique or contestation at the heart of it, as you've described, shown, I guess, both within the public as in the professional milieu, but also to the broader public, if ever it was? Or was it something that was just kind of handed on?
No, that's a great question. I think one has to...
The reason I ask it is because in your book you have these beautiful pictures, as one would expect from a quality book like this. There's this, for example, on page 48 in figure 2.1, convergence of puffing chimney, lungs and atmosphere in a plate in Johann Jakob Scheutz's Physica Sacra. And it's a gorgeous, peculiar, Logier-like engraving. You've talked about them in Le Corbusier's drawings of lungs. There's photographic work that's done. And then there's other examples which almost look like children's illustrations, which look like they might be being used to communicate with the public. And then on page, I'm going to try and find the page number, page 69, there's one that's quite clearly a drawing that is being used as an infomercial in some respects. So there's all of this kind of drawing around this thing, architects doing what they do. They draw solutions to problems. Maybe I've answered my own question. I don't think I have. Was there a strategic approach to this? Was there a realization that the public needed persuading and that there was going to be certain representational devices deployed in this way?
I think first and foremost, so I think it's crucial to distinguish here too the different disciplines. So I think what you mentioned now, a reference to is one drawing in particular by Fritz Kahn. So if you look at those drawings, I think they pertain more to, or they originate from popular culture, which is also again part of the book, really trying to embed architecture in this broader cultural endeavor. Trying to understand architecture as a product of culture more broadly. So because I also do theory first and foremost, and history, of course, deeply entangled with each other, but I'm often interested in the why. So really the objectives in certain things, not so much pure history in terms of positivism. So what happened when and to what degree, but why do these things really happen? What's the underlying rationale behind it? And part of that, I think, has to do with an understanding of this kind of project or paradigm through the lens of different disciplines. So I think I would be hard pressed to conflate all of that. So I think one still has to differentiate someone like Fritz Kahn, because that was clearly, I mean, this is what you refer to, the life of humans, das Leben des Menschen, which is one of the most popular science publications in Weimar Germany from the 1920s. That is also widely discussed in all kinds of scholarships nowadays, in media theory and so on and so forth. But that was clearly catered towards the public. So he was the prime, say, infographics pioneer. And I think Fritz Kahn in particular, with all his, various team members, trained architects as well, but also painters, they developed this whole strategy of informing the broader public about the inner workings of the human body. So that's a book from medical popular science, six volume publication from the 1920s. And this whole endeavor of infographics was precisely geared toward educating the broader public and trying to explicate and illustrate very complex inner workings of the human body by specific visual idioms. And I think that's still somewhat different from what some of the architects in their writings, or say experimental hygienists in the 19th century did. So Pettenkofer, for instance, I think I also have one of these illustrations in the book. He would more directly illustrate some of his experiments, and then the Hungarian Josef Fodor also does that. So oftentimes you have scientific settings that are then being engraved or illustrated in engravings that are more technical in nature. And then I think Corbusier, of course, is always the great starting point, because he was such a prolific and contested writer at the time, much more so than others. I mean, which is not to say that architects like Erich Mendelsohn didn't really publish or they didn't write, but they clearly wrote much less than Corbusier. There is few publications, there are some public lectures, but of course, no one was so prolific as Corbusier at the time. So he's always a good starting point to look into all things architectural. And here too, in many of his books, as I alluded to earlier, you find direct, not just allusions to physiology and ideas of breathing, but direct incorporations of drawings of human lungs. And sometimes he scribbled them by himself, and then sometimes he took them from popular science books and included them. But it was a clear, in that sense, in Corbusier's case in particular, it was a clear strategy, I would say, to persuade his readership, of course, for the potential success of his ventilation system. So air exact, or respiration exact, as he used to call it at the time. So really also carrying in the direct wording of that concept traces of human physiology. So it was a proto air conditioning system of mechanical ventilation at the time that he has developed, and then failed to successfully implement in some of his projects from the 20s and 1930s. We all know this history from Rainer Benham, who has a very convincing chapter in the architecture of the well-tempered environment. But really the idea here for Corbusier is to produce this analogy between human lungs and the building as a technical object. So because there is a certain say traffic between the external air and the human body, and he has all these numbers, I mean, all the metrics of the lungs capacity, how many liters of air we need, how much oxygen the human being requires per hour, and so on and so forth. And because of that, he tries to invent an air conditioning or mechanical ventilation system that facilitates this process inside the building. And I think this is so interesting. So with regard to these strategies, I think one has to be careful not to confuse all the disciplines, because I think they operate in different, say, registers. And then also with regard to popular culture, popular science, as it were, Fritz Kahn, there are also many breathing systems, some of which I discuss in the second chapter, where certain physicians and medical practitioners, naturopathists, and so on and so forth, they really try to educate the public at large also with regard to breathing techniques. And there are many of these popular books that have been published from, say, the beginning of the 20th century onwards. And they, of course, have their own strategies. There is one from the 1860s, or even prior, from a German guy called Schreber. And there you really have, as often presented in double exposure, you have the human body in two different states, in two different conditions, and the images are superimposed as if to insinuate the movement, or the expansion and the contraction of the thoracic cage. And there is a strong desire to educate the broader public of how to properly breathe. So I think that's one strategy with many of these books. So you have, in Hans Suren's case, you often see his own body in the nude, highly oiled, so he appears as a bronze statue, and then performs all the appropriate breathing exercises or bodily postures to facilitate proper breathing. And I think with regard to your question, so there is probably different kinds of strategies. In architecture, I'm not so sure really Gropius ever published anything about breathing, for instance. So this is more my critical reading or my critical understanding of the operating and opening mechanisms in the windows of the Bauhaus Dessau that I think spring from that culture. But he himself, for instance, didn't really directly refer to breathing. I mean, this is fair to say. So yes, many strategies, I think, at once, but different ones.
I take your correction. I wanted to go back and think about it a little bit, think about that idea of the breathing building. I think it's a fascinating idea, this sort of linking of an architecture as a metaphoric device with scientific knowledge, or sort of leveraging scientific and technical development towards analogy and metaphor still, which is fascinating. I want to come on to one last question, which is this lovely quote from your coda at the end of the book. Architecture in the modern period had been defined by awareness of the atmosphere as the primary realm for habitation, an alternative envelope for the building body. It was fundamentally predicated on the notion of breathing space, of literal breath, and of space that breathes, spaces inhabited by and designed for pneumatic beings. And then you track that through in the book, of course, to the change that happens in the later 20th century, mid and later 20th century, 60s and 70s particularly. And you've mentioned Rainer Banham already. Can you speak a little to this evolution? And is there a sense that this discourse, this idea of architecture as a synergistic form with the pneumatic being, as a synthetic thing, is there a sense that that still pertains as a discourse in academia and in the profession?
Yeah, I would say it came back recently, something we touched upon earlier, and I think it's got to do with the pandemic, of course. So I think that sparked new interest. I mean, the reason is also a coda in the book. So in many ways you see, I mean, perhaps I shouldn't say that, but it's not an easy way to get out of respiratory modernism, because how can you ever put an end? I mean, how can you pinpoint the origins of something and then also put an end to it? So in many ways, I think because it would require another history, which has more to do with mechanical ventilation and, of course, the invention of air conditioning. I think that would really be a counter narrative alongside this book. And of course, it will require another book or a much bigger book, which is not really what my project is about. So, but I think the parallel evolution of mechanical ventilation, not so much as mechanical ventilation as we know it from, the 19th century onward, but really air conditioning as a human desire to regulate and to be in absolute control of an interior climate. I think that's also part of the modern project, because its evolution, of course, can be traced to the early 20th century. And I think this is really what slowly brought respiratory modernism to a halt. But I think the reason why I focus and touch upon the nomadic structures or bubbles from the 60s and 70s. For one, is because, of course, they are the most salient expression of something nomadic as we know it in architecture, and I think they are the clearest symbol for me. So I'm more interested also in the imaginary of these projects here, which I only briefly discussed because, as I said, it's a coda, it's not a fully fledged chapter. So I don't think they are really the main cause for the end of respiratory modernism, but I think they are, for me, the clearest architectural visual expression of that very condition. And of course, it has much to do with seclusion. It has much to do with individualization. It has much to do with a certain severance from the environment. And I think the particularly intriguing entry point for me here too is also a textual reference, because in one of the essays that I also quote by Benham, where he recollects his recent experience at the BBC headquarters somewhere in London, where one of the inflatables was installed, and then he goes inside and experiences that, spends some time inside, and at one point in this essay he writes, these structures are nearly breathing, and that's of course one of the many metaphoric uses of architectural criticism with regard to that very idea of breathing. But of course, what he didn't really mean was an exchange, I suppose, of air, of oxygenated air, and the dismissal of carbon dioxide in air. But clearly, here too, breathing means something that is alive. So because the structure is not really solid, but it's malleable, you can touch it, you can poke it, it pushes back, it's something elastic, it's got a membrane, and so on and so forth. He says it's nearly breathing. And for me, that struck me as something very fascinating, because I get his use as a metaphor. But of course, for me, these structures are everything but breathing, because what they, I think, symbolically do, what I try to conclude also in the book, is that they rather trap a single breath inside the membrane. That's essentially what a soap bubble do. And we all know that from children's games and our previous recollections, probably from childhood, that once you create a soap bubble, you blow inside a film, and the membrane actually traps a single breath. It's not breathing as something a present participle also in English. I mean, it's an ongoing process. That's not really what the bubble for me is. It's rather seclusion. It's not a continuity between, say, a nomadic being in a house that facilitates or allows for a certain communication with the atmosphere, but it's precisely enclosure, more on a visual register than it actually does, of course. And I think that is the cultural expression for me of many of these, containers in which we often find ourselves nowadays, right? Also, the passive house that you mentioned in your questions, really airtightness. I think we've been lately, and for the better part of the last decades, of course, we've been living towards absolute airtightness. So I think one of the parallel books, of course, also with regard to mine, is Lydia Kalipoliti's history on closed worlds. That's, I think, really what it is. So I think many of the office buildings we encounter nowadays in passive houses. So there is a certain paradigm of airtightness in the name of energy efficiency. So it's precisely the opposite. It's closing us off, it's sealing us off from the natural world. And I think what brought this back into our consciousness. So if the premise still holds true that breathing is something that operates in the background and it only comes to bear when it's under duress, so something really must happen in order to make us aware of it again. So then it was clearly the recent COVID-19 pandemic. And I think many of the ramifications of that pandemic are still palpable today. And I just read a recent article in the New York Times, where the Bay Area in the United States, so San Francisco in particular, they're currently debating whether to shut down BART, which is the local high-speed train network for commuters. But the use of that train system has plummeted so much, has been created to such an extent that it's no longer affordable, and it was almost self-sufficient just by riders paying their fare. which no longer is the case. So I think the numbers just plummeted by more than half, and I think that's clearly a ramification of the COVID-19 pandemic, and in many ways also pertains to breathing space, because I think it has one's to do with a certain anxiety of being in a public space, public transportation system, and having to breathe with other people. So that's the health issue, but I think it also has to do with certain consequences and impacts on say the downtown areas of certain cities, because of course the dispersal into home office, which hasn't really fully discovered. I mean, there was a back to office call by many companies, but I think still today many people work essentially wherever they can. They just have a laptop, so there is no need to go back to the office, and there is no need to be downtown and commute. And I think all of that is really part and parcel of a bigger problem. And because of that, I think it also essentially re-entered architectural discourse, I suppose. Maybe not architecture to core or understood as the art of building, but architecture more as something broadly construed as the built environment. But I think, I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it does. It does make sense. It does make sense. I am very interested in this redevelopment or this reemergence of the absolutely enclosed building, the fallacy of the possibility of enclosure, of hermetically sealing oneself, which I think is, to me, it's like the goal to which modernity was oriented. And the working from home strategy is alienation. It's capitalism and alienation working hand in hand perfectly. And it seems to me that, and I will pull this round to your book, that this disenchantment that happened with institutional co-dwelling during lockdowns, where we demonstrated through our behavior that we didn't need the things that we claimed we needed, that they weren't actually anything other than choices we were making. And we've made this choice in the lee of this to, in a way, disenchant ourselves with that sharing, that breathing in space together, which is obviously on some levels very, very sad. On other levels, it makes quite a lot of sense. And I wonder whether we as architects have anything, whether we can do anything with that, and whether our pursuit of the hermetically sealed contemporary building, the passive house or the tower block, has in a way caused this, and whether we can unpick this. Is anybody trying to unpick this? I don't know.
Yeah, neither do I. I mean, it's also because I'm not in this particular instance. I'm not writing really as a designer, but more as a theorist and historian. So it's a scholarly endeavor, and of course, what architects and others want to do with it. I mean, of course, the hope for any such book, of course, in the first place, is that it finds an audience, a readership, and in the best of all worlds, it sparks a certain debate and inflection point of discourse, maybe, that people begin to think about certain issues more critically. But I think so much of that has also been relegated to the realm of engineering and the technicalities of the building envelope, the metrics, the performance, LEED Platinum standards. So much is no longer really part and parcel of the architectural realm, that I'm not sure we have entire agency over that. But I think at least we as I don't know, as civilians, as architects, we can debate or ponder in what world we want to live and in what spaces we want to live. And I think it clearly has to be pointed out that it's a major difference if you live in a metropolitan area like New York City or Beijing, for that matter, or in Switzerland. The air quality matters hugely, and it's a local phenomenon, of course. So we can't put that all into the same pot, as it were. And of course, you want different air quality in a place where air pollution is much higher. But I think it's a conscious decision whether we want to live, we want to be. I like that Pettenkofer expression so much. Whether we want to be in communication with the atmosphere, even though being enclosed in an interior space, or whether we consciously decide to sever this connection and to close us off, because it also means that we close us off from everyone else. It's really seclusion. It's a matter of class, of course, because certain more privileged people have more access to better air quality than others, and so on and so forth. And I think this very idea, that's the social and ethical dimension of all of that, beyond the technicalities and the discourse, is really to decide whether we want to be conspirators, breathe together, or whether we want to do it on our own terms and separate us from the rest of it by fear of infections and whatnot. I think the causes are varied and polymorphous, but I think, do we want to live together, or do we not want to do that?
It is I was going to say $1 million question, but maybe it's just like 1 million rubles or something like that. It's a big question. It's not the biggest question, but it's a wonderful point to finish on. Tim, thank you so very much for speaking with me.
Thanks for having me, Ambrose. It was very delightful.
Houses and rooms are full of perfumes. The shelves are crowded with perfumes. I breathe the fragrance myself and know it and like it. The distillation would intoxicate me also, but I shall not let it. The atmosphere is not a perfume. It has no taste of the distillation. It is odourless. It is for my mouth forever. I am in love with it. I will go to the bank by the wood and become undisguised and naked. I am mad for it to be in contact with me. That's my wife's favourite, Walt Whitman, and a bit of his poem Song of Myself from 1892. Thank you to Tim for speaking with me, which was a real pleasure. Thank you also to William Pugdatuon at Princeton University Press for setting this up, sharing the PDF, and all the aftercare as well. See the podcast description for links to the book and to Tim at work on his own website and wherever he is on social media. And thanks for listening.